the Cushites see chaos approaching. In responding to the entreaty from Judah and the members of the coalition to help stave off the invader, Shabako and Shibitku faced two daunting challenges. The pharaoh would confront the strongest military power ever to appear in the Mediterranean basin, and in doing so, they would have to cope with a great handicap. Their own forces were out of position and in disarray. That the pharaoh had to send their forces in two contingents, probably many weeks apart, suggests that the strategy of countering Assyria by means of a large-scale preemptive strike had not been planned long in advance. The contrast to Sennacherib's assiduously organized campaign is dramatic. So too is the difference in equipment. The Cushites were more lightly armed than the Assyrians. Although they carried around shields like Sennacherib's men, there were relatively little protective gear like helmets and armor. Most of the ordinary soldiers were probably bare-chested. Their kilts were slightly longer than those of the Assyrians, unlike those of the Assyrians, which were wrapped around the hip more like a bath towel. These kilts were joined at the front. Some soldiers of standing wore kilts of leopard skins. Like the Assyrians, the Cushite elite forces would have been the cavalry and chariotry. Their skill in horse breeding was renowned in the ancient world. Their war chariots would have also perhaps have been of the same large size, capable of holding 3 men as their enemies. Still, it is doubtful that the Cushites' chariotry and cavalry were the equal of their Assyrian counterparts for the simple reason that they lacked the same battle-hardened experience. The Assyrians' equestrian corps engaged in combat almost annually. The Cushites' fighting had been sporadic and usually against relatively easy competition. Assyria had tested itself against the Babylonians, the Elamites, and other formidable adversaries, but the most striking difference between the Cushite and Assyrian armies could not have been seen with the eye. It was a difference in what they were going through and what was going through their leaders' hearts and minds, in their belief systems. For the Assyrian kings, the religious justification for conquest was the aggrandizement of the god Ashur's domain and glory. But the principal god of Cush in Upper Egypt, Amun, was no imperialist deity. It was not through conquest per se that his worshippers honored him. Nonetheless, it was their Amun-based faith that impelled the Cushites to intervene in Kor. The name Amun means hidden one. His worshippers considered him to be invisible and often likened this invisibility to breath. He was the animating spirit of the universe. Some scholars see worship of Amun as closely anticipating monotheism. A Belgian specialist, Johannes de Moor, notes that in the course of the 2nd millennium BC, Amun more or less absorbed some other deities in Egypt's pantheon, including the sun god Re, so that all gods were in reality but manifestations of one god, Amun-Re, or to put it more simply, Amun. Of the 10 or so dynasties that ruled in the course of the 1st millennium BC, the 25th dynasty certainly promoted the worship of Amun the most vigorously. One served Amun by living according to Ma'at. This is a venerable concept going back to the Old Kingdom that underlies that Egyptian civilization's worldview. Lionel Casson, a classics professor at New York University, lucidly describes this crucial notion. The word is almost impossible to translate precisely, but it involved a combination of such ideas as order, truth, justice, and righteousness. Ma'at was considerably a quality, not of men, but of the world, built into it by the gods at the moment of creation. As such, it represented the God's will. A person endeavored to act in accordance with the divine will because that was the way to place himself in harmony with the gods. For the Egyptian, peasants' ma'at meant working hard and honestly. For the officials, it meant dealing justly. Symbolizing the concept in ritual was a goddess herself called Ma'at, but Ma'at's real place was outside the temple. Ideally, the principle was supposed to pervade not just everyday life, but even relations between states. Amon appointed the pharaoh to uphold Ma'at, Egypt's turmoil leading up to the Cushite conquest of 728 BC, to discover the discord involving 11 political entities, including the 22nd, 23rd, and 24th Pharaonic dynasties, was for the Cushites an extraordinary offense to the earlier concept of Ma'at, observes David O'Connor. What PA and his successors sought to do was to restore that form of peace. The Cushites were genuinely devoted to Ma'at, says O'Connor of the University of Pennsylvania. He adds their devotion, they argued, generated supernatural aid and demonstrated the legitimacy of the Cushite ascension. It also helped that shape Cushite foreign policy. Ma'at did not exist in isolation. It stood in opposition to what the Egyptians called Isfet, which meant chaos or injustice, and which was always threatening Ma'at's ordered culture. The traditional view, dating back to eons, was that the pharaoh was divinely appointed to reinforce and safeguard Ma'at, faced with Sargon and Sennacherib's threatening advances towards Egypt in the late 8th century. The Cushites would have seen those emperors as agents of chaos and regarded themselves as sustainers of Ma'at. While defense of the Nile Valley and trade considerations were the immediate reasoning for the Cushites' preemptive strike into Kor, the overarching reason was the need to maintain Ma'at. Egypt's indigenous dynasty had showed themselves incapable or unwilling to acquit themselves for their pharaonic responsibility as Amon's representatives to repel chaos from Egypt. That explains why, starting with PA, the Cushites felt themselves religiously called upon to fill the leadership void. Herodotus sheds valuable light on Cushite Egypt's internal politics in 701. Relying on Lower Egyptian sources, he says that the priest-like Cushite pharaoh was unable to bring in members of the warrior class of the Egyptians, having previously neglected these soldiers and treated them with contempt. Herodotus adds that he offended them in various ways, not least by depriving them of the 12 acres of land in which each of them had held special privilege under previous kings. As a result, not one of them was willing to fight. In saying that no Egyptians took part in the conflict, Herodotus' versions obviously exaggerates. When in his annals, Sennacherib describes the Battle of El Teke. The king observes that Egyptian charioteers and princes were fighting alongside Cushite bowmen, cavalry, and charioteers, but there are reasons to think Herodotus' version contains some truth. Among the forces that marched to face Assyrians, Egyptians were underrepresented. As we've seen, Egypt was anything but monolithic. While the 25th dynasty had succeeded in bringing a measure of unity to the two lands after reconquering Lower Egypt in 712, not all enmities would have been extinguished. If Assyria intended to conquer Egypt, would it have to make sense for it to nurture good relations with the native elements within the targeted country? Elements that would stand in the way of the conquerors, that would not stand in the way of the conquerors, that might even assist in the conquest, and that would, after victory, help administer the country. Such is the modus operandi of many empires, with which Lower Egypt's factions would Sennacherib's have cultivated warm ties in the lead up to the crisis of 701. Although the record is silent, the logical party would be Saez, seat of Tefnank's short-lived 24th dynasty. The record speaks loudly about the hostilities between the Cushites and Sayids during the periods both shortly before and shortly after Sennacherib's reign. In the decades before Sennacherib took power, the Cushites had twice overthrown the Sayid rulers. First when Tefnank was leader in 728, and then when his son Bakenra-Nef had held the throne about 16 years later. Afterwards, in the mid-7th century BC, when Assyria drove the Cushites from Egypt, Sennacherib's grandson installed the Cushites as vassal rulers of the 26th dynasty. Such was the bad blood between the two groups that the Sayyid pharaohs sought to expunge all traces of their Kushite predecessors from their temples and other buildings. Indeed, in this early 6th century BC, the 26th dynasty invaded Kush itself and laid waste to much of it. When Herodotus speaks of very poor relations between the 25th dynasty and Lower Egyptian's warrior class, then he is probably alluding to the embittered members of the Sayyid military that Kush had defeated in 712. One can understand why Shabako and later Shibitku would not have eradicated this army. Ma'at is one reason. The concept involved in important ethical and political dimensions aimed at de-escalating animosity. In 728, showing Ma'at, Pa had forgiven his adversaries after they had sworn fealty to him, even going so far as to pardon a former vassal named Namlot who had betrayed him to join Tefnak's rebellion, and later in a policy move not directly related to Sayyid officers, Shabako abolished all capital punishment for criminals. A truly astonishing action in the ancient world where executions were a justice system staple. Shabako instead put criminals to work building dikes against floodwaters. The action moved Diodorus, the Greek historian of the 1st century BC, to comment approvingly. His motives was to mitigate the rigor of the punishment for those under sentence, while providing substantial benefits to the towns in place of useless penalties. So now, with the Sayyid officers on his hand, Shabako showed mercy rather than trying to execute, imprison, or enslave them. This propensity for forgiveness by Kushite monarchs is a departure from the behavior of most of their Egyptian counterparts. It may reflect an interpretation of Ma'at distinctive to their culture. Shabako's treatment of Sayyid officers might have had a practical advantage. It could have reduced resentment in the Delta against the Napatans, and thus enabled them to focus on the external threat. By stripping the officers of generous land holdings, the pharaoh might have loosened the military class's dominance in the Delta. In redistributing this property among civilians, he may have hoped to win popular support for the Kushite dynasty and weaken whatever pro-Assyrian sentiment existed. In retrospect, it's hard to say that this Kushite policy towards the Sayyid military class was a blunder. True, the Sayyid officers still felt sufficiently resentful against the 25th dynasty as to refuse to join its war effort against Sennacherib. The boycott suggests that even at this early date that the Sayyid military was assuming that it had something to gain from an Assyrian conquest of Egypt. Still, the Sayyids did not actively make trouble for the Shabako-Shibitku tandem during the campaign against Sennacherib. Had they mounted a fifth column insurrection while Kushite forces were in core, the events of 701 may have turned out very differently. What is clear, however, is that the Kushite regime's inability to rally all the Delta forces to its cause aggravated the military disparity between itself and Assyria. Little wonder, then, that Herodotus describes Pharaoh Shibitku as lacking confidence until, in a dream, the pharaoh's god stood by him and urged him not to lose heart. Herodotus says that Shibitku, compensating for the warrior's refusal to march with him, assembled a mixed company of shopkeepers, artisans, and market people to wage the military campaign. This is not bizarre as it may sound. Years before, ever wary of possible conflict with Assyria, the Cushites would have probably prepared for such an emergency by forming a militia in Egypt. Composing such a body would have been ordinary people with a variety of civilian walks of life. This malicious purpose would have been to complement the backbone of the military, a professional standing army that would have been stationed in northern Egypt and made up not only of Cushite but also of regular Egyptian troops from Tanis and other locales more friendly to the Cushite dynasty than Suez. Herodotus' underlying point, of course, needs no adjusting. Struggling to scrape together the manpower with which to confront Sennacherib, Chpt entered the conflict as a desperate underdog. The beginning of the conflict belonged to Assyrians. According to Sennacherib, after following the curve of the Fertile Crescent to reach Kor, the imperial army came to the rebel Phoenician city of Sidon. It was a pushover. Sidon's overlord, Luli, the king of Tyre, fled to Cyprus. The terror-inspired glamour of my lordship, Sennacherib explains, had overwhelmed him. Bombastic though Sennacherib's self-praise may be, his ability to strike profound fear in his foe is undeniable. Sidon and other cities in the region under Luli's control, the annals name 6, quickly capitulated. Sennacherib placed his own man as king of Sidon. Still, despite the annals' depiction of unalloyed triumph, there may have been one hitch. Tyre, that very major port, about 40 miles down the coast from Sidon, was located on a small island several hundred yards from a town on the mainland. 4 centuries later, Alexander the Great would build the causeway to join Tyre to the mainland, and sand deposits would in time turn the island into a peninsula. Sennacherib reports that he seized this mainland town, Ushu, but is curiously silent about the fate of Tyre itself. Why? He may have not taken it. In his history of Tyre, H. Jacob Katzenstein surmises that the Assyrians lacked the ships which to capture the island. His reasonable conclusion: Sennacherib did not succeed in conquering Tyre, and therefore he speaks of Elolaus Luli only as king of Sidon. He hides his failure to conquer Tyre, but by not mentioning the city, which at this period, was the most important in Phoenicia. Moving southward along the Mediterranean coast, Sennacherib defeated the rebels Sidkai, king of the Philistine city of Ashkelon. It is not clear if Sennacherib advanced as far down the coast of Ashkelon, but he did vanquish 4 cities north of it and that belonged to King Sidkai. One of these cities was the port city of Joppa or Jaffa, which corresponds to the modern city of Tel Aviv. Sennacherib deported Sidkai and his family to Assyria. Up to this point, the only serious action that the Assyrian troops appear to have encountered was siege warfare. Now this changed. Having crossed the Sinai Desert and marched northward up Philistia's coast, the army combined of Cushite and Egyptian forces confronted the Assyrians roughly a dozen miles south of Tel Aviv on the low hills near El Teke. The only record that we have of this battle is Sennacherib's annal. Although it is brief, it helps us visualize the scene. In addition to archers, the 25th dynasty contained Egyptian charioteers as well as charioteers of the king of Cush, the elite royal squadron. The Cushite royal cavalry was also present, and an army beyond counting. One thing is curious about Sennacherib's description of his foe. He makes no mention of infantry other than bowmen. Anthony Spallinger speculates that this is not a simple oversight. The omission may mean, he suggests, that the Cushite Egyptian force was not composed of hardline infantry, but rather of quickly moving units better able to harass and geared to a swift victory, rather than to a prolonged battle wherein a large deployment of troops was required. This reinforces the idea that the plotting militia would not have been part of this strike force. Spalding makes an additional plausible deduction. In the absence of much infantry, he concludes that the 25th dynasty's army was outnumbered in both men and material. In his annals, Sennacherib, of course, asserts that he inflicted a defeat upon these forces. But in questioning that, Spallinger and many other scholars make a strong case. Hayyim Tadmor infers from omission in Sennacherib's account that the victory was rather exaggerated. The Assyriologist points out that no cogent detail of the opponent's defeat are given, except a statement about prisoners taken in the midst of battle. No numbers are given. No booty is listed. Kenneth Kitchen agrees, deducing that the Assyrians merely repulsed, not routed, the Cushite Egyptian force, thereby permitting them to regroup. It is worth noting that Sennacherib claims only to have captured an unstated number of Egyptian and Cushite charioteers and Egyptian princes. He says nothing about slaying or capturing Cushite commanders, whether they be royalty or not. In Assyrian annals, it is convention to describe victories with emphasis on the ignominious fate of defeated enemies, often with statistical precision on the number of prisoners taken. Here, such detail is conspicuously absent. After encountering this Cushite Egyptian obstacle, Sennacherib continued on his sweep, advancing through the olive-growing countryside to Ekron. Archaeologists say a mud brick wall surrounded the city, and that at the city's hardest point, a citadel tower had been constructed out of stones the size of boulders. Ekron did not withstand the attack. Sennacherib asserts, "I killed the officials and the patricians who committed the crime of rebellion and hung their bodies on poles surrounding the city." He then moved into Judah itself, where, by his own count, he captured 46 of Judah's strong cities and walled forts and countless small villages in their vicinity. The vanquished cities may have included the former Philistine city of Gath, which Hezekiah had annexed. He may have begun to deport some Judahites, though probably not many. Sennacherib captured these walled enclosures by means of siege. More specifically, he says he conquered them by means of well-stamped earth ramps and battering rams, brought thus near to the walls, combined with the attack by foot soldiers using mines, breaches, as well as sapper works. Although the king's wording appears to have to say that all 46 sites required this drastic treatment, it seems likely that some of them might have capitulated more readily. The famous relief in Sennacherib's palace tells the story of Lachish's fall in pictorial detail. The assault on Judah's second largest city demonstrates the kind of treatment that the Assyrians were capable of inflicting on Jerusalem. This attack undoubtedly had impact on Jerusalemites. As astute practitioners of psychological warfare, the Assyrians would have seen to it that eyewitness description by Judahites of Lachish's collapse reached the capital, their next major target. Here is the superb blow-by-blow translation of the sculpture by Sir Austin Henry Layard, the celebrated British excavator who in the late 19th century unearthed the relief along with the rest of Sennacherib's palace. Lachish, he says, was evidently of great extent and importance. It appears to have been defended by double walls with battlements and towers and by fortified outworks. The country around it was hilly and wooded, producing the fig and the vine. The whole power of the great king seems to be called forth to take this stronghold. In no other Assyrian sculptures were so many armed warriors seen drawn up in array before a besieged city. In the first rank were the kneeling archers. Those in the second were bending forward. Those whilst those in the third discharged their arrows standing upright, and were mingled with spearmen and slingers, the whole forming a compact and organized phalanx. The reserve consisted of large bodies of horsemen and charioteers. Against the fortifications had been thrown up as many as 10 banks or mounts, compactly built of stone, bricks, earth, and branches of trees, and 7 battering rams had already been rolled up to the wall. The besieged defended themselves with great determination. Spearmen, archers, slingers thronged the battlements and towers, showering arrows, javelins, stones, blazing torches upon the assailants. On the battering rams were bowmen discharging their arrows, and men with large ladles pouring water upon the flaming brands, which, hurled from above, threatened to destroy the rams. Ladders, probably used for escalade, were falling from the walls upon the soldiers who mounted the inclined ways to assault. The events in the bas relief do not occur simultaneously, but sequentially. Other scenes show events after the city's fall. Beneath its walls were seen Assyrian soldiers impaling their prisoners. From the gateway of an advanced tower or fort issued a procession of captives, reaching to the presence of the king, who gorgeously arrayed, received them seated on his throne. Seated on his throne. Amongst the spoils were furniture, arms, shields, chariots, vases of metal in various forms, camels, carts drawn by oxen and laden with women and children. Several prisoners were already in the hands of the torturers. 2 were stretched naked on the ground to be flayed alive, while others were being slain by the sword before the throne of the king. The haughty monarch was receiving the chiefs of the conquered nations, who crouched and knelt humbly before him. They were brought into the royal presence by the Tartan of the Assyrian forces, followed by his principal officers. This Tartan is the same high official whom 2 Kings described as later coming to the wall of Jerusalem to demand surrender. The archaeological evidence in recent decades confirms much of what the bas relief has to say about the attack itself. Those vestiges that have been unearthed indeed suggest a heroically desperate defense. After the Cushites had repelled the Assyrian initial assault, the besiegers constructed a ramp of stones that, excavators rose to the very top of the city wall. A horizontal platform would have rested on the summit of this steep incline. From the platform, siege machines and soldiers would have attacked the defenders from an equal height. Traces remain of the Cushites' response. They built a counter ramp out of debris. This construction rose even higher than the attackers' ramp. Excavators have found an iron chain and large stones with perforations through which ropes would have been attached. The defenders would have used these to try to topple the siege machines. By constructing this counter ramp, the Cushites would have bought themselves time with which to build a new line of defense to fall back upon once the Assyrians had finally overrun the city wall. That may have been the second wall that Layard refers to. That may have been the second wall that Layard refers to. Archaeologists also made a gruesome discovery at Lachish, 4 caves used as mass graves. They counted bones of some 1,500 people, presumably victims of the siege. Some of these bones were burnt, leading archaeologists to speculate that if these people had not actually burned to death, they died, in one expert's careful words, in a catastrophe in which fire was involved, and the corpses were then placed in these caves. An examination of 695 of these skulls had led other experts to conclude that almost half belonged to adult females and to so-called immature individuals, which would mean that these were civilians rather than regular soldiers. When the Assyrians soon gathered under the walls of Jerusalem, the people of the city would have had reason to expect the enemy to show the same kind of determination against them. Isaiah, observing the condition of Judah from the vantage point of Jerusalem, declares, "Your country is desolate, your cities lie in ashes." Of the entire country, he says, only Jerusalem is left as defenseless as a watchman's hut in a vineyard or a shed in a cucumber field. The prophet also says that many, indeed, he claims all of Jerusalem's top leaders, presumably military, ran away and were captured without resistance. But we know that Hezekiah was not totally abandoned. Second Kings says that at least three senior court officials, none of them military, did remain with Hezekiah throughout the siege. According to the reconstruction of the campaign based on Isaiah, the Assyrians would have advanced on Jerusalem in two groups. While the main force remained with Sennacherib in the general region of Lachish, a smaller group would have descended on Jerusalem from the Assyrian province of Samarina, formerly Samaria in the north. This smaller group would have presumably have reached Jerusalem first and initiated the siege. The book of 2 Kings says that while Sennacherib was engaged at Lachish, he sent from there to Jerusalem a large army. It was commanded by the Tartan, or viceroy, who in the Assyrian army was second only to the king. Two other senior royal attendants accompanied him, Rabsaris, literally the chief eunuch, and Rabshakeh, or literally the chief cupbearer or butler. These two officials' actual function, however, would have greatly transcended their rather menial titles. They would have been among high-ranking members of the imperial elite. Rabshakeh's duties, while hard to pin down, would have included military and civil responsibilities, perhaps even the administration of a province. Lachish relief depicts the senior of these three august Assyrians. Layard's description of the king's main general standing outside Lachish's wall suggests how glaringly imposing he must have looked to Jerusalemites a few days or weeks later when he confronted them with terms of their surrender. The Tartan, his squared beard reaches down to his chest, was clothed in embroidered robes and wore on his head a fillet adorned with rosettes and long tasseled braids. His rich robes also had tassels and reached his ankles. No contemporary sources describe the physical appearance of the Tartans' two companies of Jerusalem, the Rabshakeh and Rabsaris, but they must have been comparably elegant. As emissaries of the world's greatest empire, part of their job in encountering the Jerusalemites would have been to inspire them with awe and a sense of abject inferiority. The three walked up to the city's walls. There, within full hearing of Jerusalemites crowding the rampart, they parleyed with three ranking officials of Hezekiah's court. The Assyrian speaker was Rabshakeh. While he was not the trio's highest-ranking member, he was evidently fluent in the language of Judah, which he used in addressing Hezekiah's representatives. Kogan and Tadmor speculate the official may have been of Hebrew origin, his family having been deported from Israel to Assyria. From the contents of his remarks, it is clear that he switched from reading aloud a letter from Sennacherib to speaking spontaneously on his own authority. The biblical text presents the envoy as skillfully weaving a series of arguments in favor of surrender. Jerusalem's base itself, its self-confidence. Jerusalem bases its self-confidence, says Rabshakeh, on empty talk instead of on military skill, instead of on military skill. In relying on the Pharaoh for help, he says Jerusalem is like a person who seeks support by leaning on a reed, and whose hand will be punctured when the reed inevitably splinters. He is employing adroit, incisive wordplay. The reed was a symbol that Egyptians commonly used to denote Upper Egypt. Hezekiah, he goes on, has already undermined Yahweh's authority. The king destroyed that God's altar and shrines in the countryside, centralizing the cult in Jerusalem. Yahweh, therefore, owes Hezekiah no favors. Yahweh himself told Sennacherib to destroy all of Judah. The Rabshakeh claims, as an argument that seems to seize on Isaiah's declaration that Sennacherib's army is but an instrument of divine punishment. The official added a taunt. If Jerusalem would rather resist than give up, Assyria will then even lend the city 2,000 horses. If you can find that many men to ride them, a way of underscoring the desertion and the futility of Hezekiah's resistance. With colorful imagery, the Assyrian then lays before the Jerusalemites the alternative. If Hezekiah rejects the terms of surrender, they will needlessly starve, having to eat their own excrement and drink their own urine. If the city yields, Assyria will deport the people to an unnamed land of olive oil and honey. Finally, Rabshakeh says, no national god has ever successfully stood up to Ashur, even the national gods of more powerful people than the Judahites. The list of conquered nations includes Samaria, painful reminder of Jerusalem's Yahwist, of their co-religionist fate just 2 decades before. It is important to understand that these scenes owe much to the Second Kings writer theological embellishment. It is rather unlikely, for example, that Rabshakeh could have been familiar with Isaiah's argument that Yahweh was using Assyria to destroy Jerusalem. Still, the core of the encounter rings with authenticity. Had the parley never in fact occurred, it would have made for a more fluid storytelling for Sennacherib himself to call for surrender at the city's gates. As well, even though only one imperial envoy is necessary to speak to Jerusalemites, the story presents 3, a pointless clutter, and it carefully identifies each by an exotic title that actually existed. Another element that rings true in the Rabshakeh is the Rabshakeh insisting on pitching his oration as much to the crowd on the rampart as the royal officials. When Hezekiah's anxious representatives asked the Rabshakeh to switch from Hebrew to Aramaic, the language of the Western Assyrian Empire, that the townspeople will not understand, he shows his skill at intimidation by insisting on continuing in Hebrew, the language of Jerusalemites. He also insinuates that by representing a parley in a language that the citizens do not know, the royal court is trying to pull a fast one on ordinary folks. Indeed, he even hints that if Hezekiah does not capitulate, the people should overthrow him. These are the sorts of details and subtleties that one would expect a narrator to invent. Indeed, we know that in parallel situations involving a siege of Babylon, the Assyrians also used the same ploy. Of addressing ordinary people in hopes of undermining their loyalty. However, the authenticity of the next scene, which accents the importance of Yahweh's piety, is less clear. When his officials return to the palace and report to Hezekiah on the Assyrian speech, the despairing king humbles himself, ripping his clothes and donning sackcloth, and visits Yahweh's temple. He then sends a message to Isaiah, even though the prophet is a vehement critic of the royal court, and tells him, "May the Lord your God hear these insults from the Assyrians and punish those who spoke to them." Sennacherib's annals speak of surrounding the city with an earthwork, and it is probably at this point, after Hezekiah has refused to yield, that this barrier goes up. This wall of soil and rock would have kept anyone from fleeing the city, thus preventing mutiny. in the number of months, thus preventing any mutiny, thus preventing any diminution in the number of mouths to feed, and hence effectively hastening the siege's end. It would have prevented Hezekiah himself from escaping and sending troops out to launch a surprise attack on the Assyrian camp. 2 Kings gives Isaiah a role more prominent than one would expect, responding to Hezekiah's message on the need for Yahweh to punish Assyria for having insulted the deity. The prophet tells his king via messenger not to worry. Isaiah says reassuringly that Yahweh had this to say about Sennacherib: "Behold, I will put a spirit in him, so that he will hear a report and return to his own country, and I will strike him down by sword in his own country." Isaiah stated confidence in the city's invulnerability is a tipping off that this particular scene is not historical. Sennacherib, having conquered Lachish, is busy besieging a smaller city, Libnah, just north of Lachish. While there, he receives a report that an Egyptian army is approaching under the command of Cush's king Taharka. The young Napatan is in fact only a prince at this moment and will not become pharaoh until 690 BC, when the book of 2 Kings was written much later. Taharka was famous as a pharaoh, not as a prince. Kitchen has a useful analogy. Today, people might say that Queen Elizabeth II of England was born in 1926. He notes only a fool and a pedant would seek to correct the statement, but pointing out that she was a princess, not a queen, at her birth. By pointing out that she was a princess, not a queen, at her birth. Many scholars assume that Chpt would have placed Taharka, then aged 20 or 21, in nominal command of this force, with generals acting as important advisors. Several scholars challenge Taharka's involvement. In a minority view, Donald Redford calculates that Taharka would have been in his teens in 701. Only a biblical writer's gaffe, he says, can explain the reference to Taharka. Quite simply, Taharka's was the only pharaonic name known to the author of 2 Kings, verse 19, for the period. Dutch scholar Klaus Smelik also insists that the biblical author did not know the name of the Egyptian commander and therefore opted for Tirhaka because he was well known. Paul Dion and Spallinger also focus on the biblical writer's faulty memory, while Dion of the University of Toronto's Department of Near East Studies does not question Taharka's presence on grounds of age. He deduces that the biblical author simply threw in Taharka because of this pharaoh's well-known resistance to Assyria in the second quarter of the 7th century. For his part, Spallinger declares that the name of Egypt's Chpt was soon forgotten after his death, and for the writer of 2 Kings, the well-known Taharka therefore became the obvious choice. In short, the Bible simply plucked Taharka's name out of thin air. To this barrage of skepticism about the Napatans' prince participation, I offer several observations. A tender age is no barrier where nominal rank is concerned. The new kingdom was the great inspirational model for the 25th dynasty, and the greatest of the new kingdom's pharaohs was Ramses II. When the ruler was a 10-year-old prince, he received the titular position of commander-in-chief of the army. The child remained at home during foreign wars, but by the age of 14 and 15, he accompanied the army to the western delta in a campaign against the Libyans. In the ancient world, a more than a token leadership role in military affairs was quite within the grasp of males of high station who were in the 18 to 21 age range. The most obvious example is that of Alexander the Great. The ancient sources report that the Macedonian prince was 18 years old when he led a unit of 2,000 cavalry, part of a larger army, into full-pitched battle against the Greeks and performed brilliantly. Those sources say that when Alexander was 20, his father died, that the Macedonian army acclaimed him king, that he led an expeditionary force northward beyond the Danube to subdue hostile peoples, and that he destroyed the rebellious Greek city of Thebes. The ancient text also says that when he was 21, he debarked with his army on a Turkish beach, hurled his spear into the sand, and declared that Asia was his, and that he then went on to trounce the mighty Persians. If the historians accept the veracity of this performance and also of that of young Ramses' resistance to accepting Taharka's participation, and also that of young Ramses' resistance to accepting Taharka's participation in Judah's campaign seems curious. Taharka demonstrated remarkable leadership qualities in the course of his long career. If he possessed such qualities as an adult, it follows that even as a young man that these may have manifested themselves. Although Taharka was young, it's a matter of record that Chpt showed marked preference for Taharka over other older male members of the royal family, members who might ordinarily expect precedence over him. In an inscription at Kawa composed after he had himself become pharaoh, Taharka writes about how Chpt had preferred him to his other brothers during the period that appears to have led up to the conflict of 701. Although at the time this important meeting between Chpt Taharka may have although at the time of this important meeting with Chpt, Taharka may have already possessed a military background. The translator of the Kawa text suggests that the Egyptian term Taharka uses to describe himself at the time at the meeting of that meeting, young man, may contain the nuance of meaning young warrior. The term is Hawin Nifre. The translators say this may well refer to the ancient designation for elite troops, such a status would strengthen the idea of Taharka that Taharka possessed respectable army credentials. Years later, the choice of Taharka as pharaoh would represent a departure from what William Adams called the Cushites' preferred order of succession, whereby the crown would revert to the deceased king's surviving eldest brother and then to the younger brothers. If there were no more brothers, the crown would go to the original king's oldest son. Adams' attempt to explain this break with the tradition seems reasonable if others with better family credentials than Taharka were passed over. He says it was perhaps because he had shown exceptional ability at an early age. If the pharaoh overlooked such credentials in selecting Taharka as his successor, it is easy to imagine him earlier disregarding them in choosing an expedition commander. The claim that biblical writers forgot all about Chpt, as well as his co-regent Shabako, and therefore omitted their names from the account of the deliverance is highly questionable. In a 1965 article, Michael C. Astor examines the reference to one Sabteka in Genesis 10:6-7. On the basis of linguistic analysis, he concludes that this name is obviously identical with that of the pharaoh Shabbataka, which is in itself a variant of the form Chpt. Astor's brief 4-page article makes no attempt to examine the historical ramifications of his research, but if the Southern Illinois University scholar is correct in his interpretation of Shabteka, this would demolish Spallinger, Dayon, and Redford's weakly argued supposition that biblical writers knew nothing of Chpt and they simply slapped Taharka's name into the deliverance story because he was the only Cushite pharaoh they have heard of. If the Cushite Egyptian army had indeed played only an irrelevant or a peripheral role in the Assyrian withdrawal, as most scholars maintain, it is easy to understand why the biblical writers might have not greatly cared whose name they attached to the leadership of the army. If the army had been irrelevant, in other words, so might its leadership. If, however, the army had played a decisive role, the biblical writers' attitude would have would be much more serious. It is unlikely that they would have treated lightly the identity of the leader of the military force that had saved the kingdom. Finally, there is this. In the 1st century BC, the Greek writer Strabo referred to Taharka as an illustrious leader of a military expedition. Although Strabo does not identify that expedition, his characterization of Taharka as a great military figure adds credentials to the Second Kings assertion. It seems very probable, then, that Prince Taharka was deeply involved in the leadership of an army that Chpt dispatched to Kor, not necessarily the army that fought at El Teka, but the one that subsequently arrived in Kor. Taharka's specific role is more difficult to nail down. Taharka could have been the effective leader, or the titular leader with few real responsibilities, or one of several members of royal sharing of the royalty sharing in leadership, and because he eventually became pharaoh, the one who later became most closely identified with the campaign. Or he could have held the title of leader and at the same time shared the effective leadership with generals. Whatever the case, because this Cushite prince is the only person whom any ancient sources identify as belonging to the expedition's leadership, it is entirely proper to call this second force Taharka's army. If I had to choose the likeliest of 4 plausible scenarios for Taharka's rule, I would select the last, that Chpt gave his promising young cousin the ultimate authority over this second army while surrounding him with experienced military professionals. It is just after Sennacherib hears word of Taharka's approach that the logic of Second Kings account becomes bewildering. The narrative appears to repeat some of the story's main elements. In an apparent response to the report of Taharka's approach, Sennacherib sends Hezekiah a letter that essentially repeats the message that Rabshakeh had already delivered, that the god of Ashur can crush Hezekiah just as he did the kings of the cities that Rabshakeh had previously listed. Hezekiah reacts to this second message in much the same way as he did to the first one. He goes to the Temple of Solomon, complains of Assyrian insults of Yahweh, and calls Yahweh to deliver Jerusalem from Assyria. Isaiah enters the story a second time, saying once again that Assyria will fall to destroy Jerusalem, let alone even shoot an arrow at it. If the storyline becomes perplexing in this section of the biblical account, so does the quality of the writing, the rigorous narrative that makes the Rabshakeh insidious speech a treat to analyze, and the pithiness that characterizes Hezekiah and Isaiah's statements give way to windy didactic declarations by all 3 speakers. It is now that the story's double climax arise. In the night following Isaiah's declaration that Yahweh will save the city because of his attachment to David's dynasty, Yahweh's angel went out and struck the Assyrian camp, 185,000 men. At daybreak, there were dead bodies all about. There is no explanation of what means the angel employed for the mass slaughter. Sennacherib, who before had been belittling Yahweh, lifts the siege of Jerusalem and returns to Nineveh. In the second climax, 2 of Sennacherib's sons kill their father. A third son, Esarhaddon, succeeds him. The narrative makes this patricide sound as though it took place on the heels of Sennacherib's return to Nineveh, an expression of Yahweh's swift justice. This twofold climax, laden with religious import, is a twofold disappointment. The first climax relies on a miraculous solution that will strain the credulity of most modern readers. The second climax relies on the cheap trick of telescoping events. The historical fact is that the king went on to enjoy another 20 years of conquest before his sons assassinated him. All historians who deal with Sennacherib's invasion agree on this 20-year interval. Scholars consider the literary device of the angel to be like an opaque screen that conceals the real cause of Assyria's withdrawal. Let us now consider their favorite theories on this cause.